Today's guest on the Raphael'S Astrology interview is Melanie Reinhart, whose many years of experience includes teaching, public speaking, and writing. She's a Bachelor of the Arts and has been a professional astrologer since 1975. Not only that, she's obtained a prize-winning diploma from the Faculty of Astrological Studies in Great Britain, whom she also serves as a patron, as well as gaining the Charles Harvey Award for Exceptional Service to Astrology. Among her many excellent published works are Chiron and the Healing Journey, which originated in 1989, and more recently, Chiron, Saturn, and the Centaurs from 1996. And it's the Centaurs which are the main subject of today's interview. Melanie, good afternoon.
Well, good afternoon, James. It's lovely to be talking to you.
Anyway, tell us something about your work in astrology. At the present time, is there anything new we should know about?
Yes. Well, at the moment, what I've been concentrating on is I started my own little publishing imprint called Starwalker Press. So I'm just doing some revision of my existing books and getting them all out into the digital formats. Yeah. In preparation for hopefully writing some new material, yes, which I look forward to a lot, but I want to get all of this out of the way first. So it's quite a lot of technical work, but also very satisfying.
Now, can you tell me how you first became interested in astrology?
Yes, I enjoy saying this because I first became connected, let's say, with astrology, yeah, when I was 10 years old, and that so happened because I was off school because I'd broken my arm, yeah, and found my way to the local library, having pleaded off school as much as I could, right? Yeah. And this was Rhodesia, as it was then called, in a kind of pre-war situation, with sanctions and, all kinds of stuff happening. Yeah. And anyway, it was very much a kind of agrarian economy. So the National Library had one shelf about a meter long, yeah, of philosophy, psychology, and religion. And that was basically the sum total. Mind-blowing for those of us who've lived in London. Yeah. And anyway, on that shelf were, a few things like some work of Freud and Jung, yeah, and things like the Bhagavad Gita and Theosophy and so forth. And I started systematically working my way through this shelf. And amongst the books was a small book on astrology, and I wish I could remember what the title and author was, but I can't. Anyway, I vividly remember opening this book, standing there with my arm in plaster. Yeah. And my first reaction was indignation. Imagine, this 10-year-old kid. And indignation because I knew somehow that there was way more to it than was being expressed in this little book. Yeah. So as a Sun in Gemini person, my curiosity was instantaneously engaged. So I learned all of the sun signs and the dates that went with them. Yeah. And then I systematically asked every single person who crossed my path when their birthday was, and started to just try and look and watch and observe and see for myself, what is this? Anyway, I went on like that for years, and eventually I did go down to Cape Town to attend university. And when I was there, a friend gave me, I think it may have been a birthday present, of this marvelous little book by Dane Rudhyar called The Pulse of Life. Yeah. I still think it's one of the greatest astrology books ever written. Yep, it is inspirational. Yeah, it is. And I remember opening the book at my sun sign, of course, we would all do that, and being stopped in my tracks by the depth and the beauty of what was written there. I remember standing there weeping, reading this book. It was fantastic. And in that moment, I kind of dedicated myself to really following where this extraordinary path of knowledge would take me. And I did, And eventually I relocated to England And I also had the enormous good fortune and serendipity, I have to say. I lived in a spiritual community for a number of years, and unbeknown to me, the man who was the facilitator of this community at that time was the manager of a small publishing company called Cervera. They still exist.
Yeah.
But they, way back, had been the first people to take Rujar's work seriously enough to start putting it all into print. And so in the community was like the complete works, first edition of Dane Rujar's material, which I devoured. So I had a very kind of specific diet of astrological nourishment in those days, and I just feel very grateful for that.
Yes, you would.
And then for many years, I literally just was immersed in Rujar, and then, of course, taught myself how to calculate. And then I had the ideal laboratory type situation of observing people I was close to, people whose lives I shared, with a lot of intense things happening. So that was basically my field study, apprenticeship type of thing in astrology. And it was after that that I then went through the faculty course, by which time I was already working professionally. So it was a kind of strange back to front way of doing things, but that's how it happened.
So when you were observing all these other people, I mean, you must have stopped to think sometime, how does it really work?
Yeah, I did. And I still ask that question, and I still don't know, because there is no explanation in large quote marks that I have ever come across that makes any sense to me, frankly. Like, it doesn't really matter what the orientation is by way of people explaining. It can never go far enough to really touch the profundity of what you see with your own eyes and your own capacity for discernment when you actually study astrology in depth. And there's no substitute for that, What I am aware of is, of course, down the ages, astrology being such an ancient art, down the ages it has been, as it were, explained in one way or another that kind of fit the prevailing worldview of that culture and those times. And all of that is very interesting to me, but it still doesn't really crack it,
No.
I prefer to sit in wonder at what is, to me, the living mystery of astrology.
Yeah.
And I love the way in astrology, for me, it is a living mystery, and I work with it every single day almost. But that said, it also requires a lot of good, solid left brain work, the maths, the technical stuff, being organized with your thoughts. And then, of course, if you actually work at it, like any job you do, you have to be reasonably organized with stuff like filing and, all that. So it's a high demand job, I think. And I'm happy to tinker around with, just as it were, keeping the show on the road and what effort that takes, and allow the living mystery to just be there.
I'm always looking for a robust explanation that would silence the critics, but I think I agree with you basically. There probably isn't one. There is no way of, you can't convince anyone by argument that it works.
No, you can't. No, absolutely. I do agree, James, I really do. And what I also know, I'm more or less repeating myself here, but to immerse oneself in the study of astrology is the way, in my view, to understand it. Because you have the evidence of your own eyes, your own thoughts. You can see the stuff happening and working, and that's good enough for me. And I love the fact that, at least I believe, it can't really be explained, because we do live in a world, the contemporary world, we're big on explanations and stuff. And, I have another kind of view here about the critics, right?
Yeah.
And this might be quite controversial, I don't know, but I'll say it anyway. I think the critics do us a service in the following way, because basically, as long as people think that what astrology is a load of old rubbish, they're more likely to just leave us alone to do the work, for goodness sake. But if they once got wind of the fact of what it really is about, we might have all kinds of obstacles in our path and, I don't know, government regulation bodies and all that, because this is what's happened in the field of alternative medicine. In the main, those branches of alternative medicine who've really put a lot of effort into trying to get credibility and status in society and all the rest of it, in many cases it has backfired in a very sad way. And I hope that will never happen with astrology, because I'm fine if everybody thinks that I'm an idiot doing what I do. I truly do not mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's the present scientific paradigm, isn't it, that says, well, astrology can't work because everything has to be cause and effect. Even though, even though we're finding in quantum physics now that cause and effect has no place quite often.
Yeah, it's almost like, well, the way I see it in my kind of simplistic way is that, of course, there are levels of reality where we know cause and effect works because we live in that dimension every day. Like there's a cup on my desk at the moment, and if I push it, it'll fall on the floor and shatter.
Yeah.
And I did it, right? But that's a very gross level of dealing with just form and sort of Newtonian push-pull variety of energies. And we certainly know from contemporary physics that ain't the whole story of the reality that we inhabit.
Yeah, the universe is not made of matter, ultimately.
Yeah, exactly.
It's energy, and then it becomes amorphous, doesn't it? It's about...
That's right.
Potentiality.
Right.
It's about processes and movement and potentiality. I mean, a good...
Correct.
I think it was Niels Bohr
said, saying that.
Atoms are not things.
That's right. It reminds me of, I think it's page 1 of The Pulse of Life, the Dane Rudolph book I mentioned. There's an absolutely stunning paragraph there where he flags this up.
Yeah.
And says, we no longer inhabit the same worldview that we used to, and we now know that the very table that might be in front of us is a kind of a process of whirling atoms and energies. Like the more deeply you look into it, that's kind of what you start to see.
Yeah, you get even some, you might call them maverick physicists and modern physicists, who are saying that Heinz Pagels, for one, I think he's passed away now, who said that it's idle to talk to ask where is the electron, because it's only there when we look for it, and he's implying that we put it there by looking for it.
Yes.
So you create your own universe. I mean, there are connections there.
Yes, and for example, before we started the recording, I explained to you about the power cut situation here.
Yeah.
Prefacing it by saying, I think Mercury retrograde is doing its thing.
Yeah. Because
Mercury turns direction in a few days, and often, a few days around a station is when, stuff happens that demonstrates that planet's energy. And, at a very simple level, how much more fun that is than getting completely stressed out because I'm sitting here in a power cut. I'm thinking, Mercury's doing its thing. What fun. Do you see?
Yeah.
It's a whole different world.
Yeah. Okay. Well, moving on. Now, we know that one of your specialities is Chiron. So, would you please introduce Chiron to us?
Ooh, that's a tall order. I'll start with the simple things.
Yeah.
Chiron was discovered in 1977, actually in mid-October, and then the announcement of the discovery was made on the 1st of November, so it will soon be Happy Birthday, Chiron. In fact, I believe it was October the 18th, the discovery date. So here we are nearly on that date.
Right.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
See, there's another example, right, of what I was saying.
Yeah.
And what was interesting there was a number of things. First of all, it was an object found where no object was expected according to Bode's law. And it was therefore difficult to categorize. They didn't know what it was. So it was too small, they thought, to be a planet. It wasn't in the right place according to Bode's law, etc. And so officially it was first called a planetoid, which means a planet-like object.
Right.
And it was also named by the guy who discovered it. Now, that doesn't always happen. The more usual process is there's a big international body called the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, and they are the guys who do all the numbering and the naming of the objects that are now being discovered thick and fast as we speak, right?
Yeah.
And they have a big conference once a year, and decisions get made and things get named. But it's rare that the discoverer would choose a name and that would stick or get voted in kind of pretty much immediately. But that's what happened. And the guy who discovered it, his name was Kowal.
Yeah.
He named this object Chiron because it was discovered in between Saturn and Uranus. And it so happened, in quotes, here we go with the serendipity, this fellow was quite knowledgeable about mythology. So he figured, well, if the two objects either side of this thing are Saturn and Uranus, and that's Kronos and Uranus in the Greek pantheon, well then Chiron has to have something to do with that lineage.
Yeah.
So because it was kind of a maverick, weird thing that nobody quite knew what it was, he named it Chiron, because Chiron isn't part of the central Olympian lineage in Greek mythology. He was conceived when Kronos, his father, and his mother Philyra, who was a nymph, they were both in their horse form. So when Chiron was born, he came out as a centaur. Now, that's one version of his parentage. There is another version, which is, there's a whole genre of centaurs out there who were descended from Ixion. And this is very interesting because in the Greek mythology, there are thousands of centaurs, and they are known as a kind of wild, unruly bunch, a kind of maybe out of control football crowd type of thing.
That's right.
But amongst that lot, there are a few of them who have individual parentage and lineage as well. And those are the ones that are more individuated, let's say, than the great unwashed mass, let's say, of centaurs who prowl around and rampage through wedding parties and take the wine and take the bride and generally make mayhem.
Yep.
But these other ones that have their own lineages, you see them cropping up with maybe just one or two small anecdotes that reference their story or their character. But in the case of Chiron, there's a fully fledged characterology there with many stories, and he even had a wife, and very unusually, they even had a daughter. And the daughter was skilled in divination, and some say she's like the sort of prototype astrologer and so forth. But back to Chiron, he, in his story, when he was first born, his mother was so horrified at him coming out only half human that she abandoned him to die and prayed to the gods to be made into anything other than what she was. In other words, mother of a monster. So the gods obliged. She was turned into a linden tree, and Chiron, in the time-honored manner of heroes, was rescued by a shepherd and taken to the sun god Apollo. who foster fathered him. So under his tutelage, Chiron became a kind of wise mentor, and pretty many Greek heroes, all the famous ones, went to Chiron for a period of tutelage to prepare them for their destiny as heroes. Very interesting detail. In the fullness of time, Chiron received a wound that he could not heal himself. And so his attempt to heal this unhealing wound accompanied him through his own work of being a healer and a mentor and a wise man and teacher for all these people. The story does resolve in that Chiron changes place with Prometheus, and in so doing was able to die, because the problem with this injury was because he was this kind of demigod, Chiron could not die, and he also couldn't heal it. So he endured an enormous long time of suffering, which was released when he changed places with Prometheus, and in so doing was able to die and was immortalized in the constellation of Centaurus. Now, this is a story which speaks in a very direct way to the meaning of Chiron. And here I want to quote a dear friend, mentor, and colleague of mine, who sadly is no longer with us, namely Howard Sesfortis.
Oh, yes.
He simply said, Chiron is about the wounds that make us wise. So profound and simple and beautiful. So Chiron in the horoscope.
Can I just add to that?
Yes, please.
They make us wise because they bring us compassion for other people suffering as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was my friend and colleague Brian Clark who pointed that out vis-a-vis the symbolism of Chiron changing places with Prometheus. He said it's like walking that mile in someone else's moccasins.
Yeah.
Or standing in someone else's shoes in order to profoundly feel and understand where they're coming from.
Exactly.
And that's the transformative linchpin of the whole story. And, that's a very beautiful detail there. But now, having worked a long time with Chiron, what I can also see is that this sense of it's like a raw place in the chart for many people. Now, let me qualify that by saying that I do very much see Chiron as a significator of a particular kind of awakening. And here I do mean an awakening of consciousness and spirituality. And for some people, that comes about through their experience of suffering, either their own or somebody else's.
Yeah.
That's not the only way, obviously, to awaken, but it is surprising for how many people that is true. And so the Chiron type of approach to illness and suffering is not to just do a kind of straight up chemical fix-it job, right? The aspirin for a headache number, although, hey, there's nothing wrong with taking an aspirin if you have a headache, but you see what I'm getting at there. It's not about suppressing the symptoms and just trying to get rid of it. It's about establishing a true dialogue with our own physical vehicle, our own body, and working with it because it's the only one we've got. And the wisdom that can be yielded to us through that process is the foundation of what's called alternative medicine or traditional medicine, etc. And what is very interesting is that there's different layers of what this suffering refers to. And one very interesting theme is that Chiron and the other bodies like Chiron, which I didn't yet mention and will park that thought and come back to it very shortly, there is an ancestral theme that's embedded in the meaning of Chiron, and I now know that for sure because I've worked with it so much. And what I mean by that is the fact that we all know about genetics and how things are inherited, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's just a kind of rather clunky, dense version of something much more profound. We don't only inherit physical characteristics and personality things from our ancestors. We inherit their unfinished business sometimes. And how that works is the following. If somebody has had a whole set of emotional pressures or physical traumas which they have not been able to resolve in their soul before they die, in some cases, not every case, not every case, it's like that unredeemed chunk of human experience is still looking for healing, and it becomes embedded in what I term the ancestral field, and then somewhere down the line, one of the descendants of that person will pick that up. Now here, looking at it in a kind of storyline way, I would say we could perhaps imagine that on the way in to incarnation, we maybe like agree a task list with however this works, right? Our higher self or some kind of presiding force. We agree a task list of things that we're going to do. And here I don't mean only things like, well, I want to go to college and, become a nurse or teach people or, whatever. It's the task list of the soul. Now that is what I call the invisible work. And there are people whose lives are much more strongly focused around that than external achievement. And so never let the former be disparaged at all, because the recognition of this ancestral theme is actually natural for people. This is not something that I would ever impose on someone I'm talking to, because I don't have to. They tell me that this is what they're thinking, and almost like behind a kind of cupped hand, like, wow, I wouldn't say this even to my wife, husband, sister, brother, etc., because they would think I was nuts.
Yeah.
But we know in our souls about this kind of subtle spiritual continuity, and it's only when that gets intercepted by a prevailing worldview that isn't too user-friendly for those natural wisdoms that abide in all of us, that there's a kind of a mismatch. But this ancestral theme is extremely powerful, and what I've noticed is that since I started practicing astrology, the world has gone into progressively more and more chaos, really, globally speaking.
Yeah.
And there's been lots more international travel, lots more people relocating to places way away from their birthplace. And so there's a lot of cultural cross-fertilization and impact. And when that happens, it starts to pull the plug on all of these ancient ancestral patterns. And then, all being well, people find a way to work with that stuff. And Chiron is one of the major significators of that. And as well, you see, in 1992, another object was found that behaved in a very similar way to Chiron. And eventually, after some discussion and, hoo-ha, it was called Pholus, Pholus. And since that time, I've lost count of how many centaurs there are, but Chiron is now considered number one of the centaurs, and a whole new subcategory of celestial objects was created to encompass these little fellows, right?
Yeah.
Chiron is now centaur number one, number two was Pholus, number three was eventually named Nessus. Now, with those three alone, there's enough material where the signification for these ancestral themes is so precise that your jaw just has to drop. It is absolutely incredible. Yeah. Around Chiron, there are often experiences of vulnerability, rawness, or suffering.
Yeah.
As well as there is often indicated some kind of really strong gift, and they kind of go together. And just to give an example of that, in the horoscope of Marilyn Monroe, it's Venus in Taurus on the midheaven, and it's conjunct Chiron. Now, everybody knows her as the goddess, right? Venus on the midheaven.
Yeah.
But more and more people know just how incredibly wounded she was and how much she suffered in her life. And so they go together in that case. And it's a signification of awakening through the acknowledgement of suffering,
yeah,
the capacity to work skillfully with it, and thus to deepen compassion, as you rightly pointed out.
Yeah.
And also there's a certain introduction to the wisdom of the body. So in that way, it's a kind of awakening to a holistic view of the world and oneself, to use a kind of much overused word, but it's a good word,
Yeah.
And you will notice Chiron's process most strongly when it's active by transit, and this is true of all of the centaurs. They really come to life when you see the transits that they're making. You can't really do a flat sort of 2D interpretation of any of the centaurs. Like, for example, we could say quite correctly that, in the horoscope of somebody who has Mercury in Capricorn, unless there are aspects that really intercept that, we can reel off a whole list of descriptive phrases that will be, give or take, very accurate. You really can't do that with Chiron and the centaurs, because it's like they come from another kind of worldview. They don't fit into that one.
Yeah.
So there it gets tricky, but it's also very, very interesting, because all you need is the basic astrology, sign and house and aspects, and even with rudimentary astrological knowledge and a bit of honest self-reflection, and you'll start to pick up the trail, you see. So that's Chiron. Now, I have two taglines, one each for Pholus and Nessus.
Yeah.
And I didn't make these up. I started using them as taglines because I heard so many people with whom I had discussed centaur transits and things in their chart actually say these phrases. So Pholus is the lid comes off, and Nessus is the buck stops here.
Right.
Now, just thinking about those two phrases tells you a whole lot about what those processes feel like. Now, there's an additional detail in the mythology of Pholus, which I first didn't take, I didn't even think about it. Then I suddenly realized that I was hearing all these stories, like I was saying about Pholus and the stories. There's a reference to 4 generations. So around Pholus, it's very interesting to look out for a theme of some kind that is exactly 4 generations long. Now, this could be that one has had, let's say, a fascination. So that's great-grandparents. So one has had a fascination with a particular great-grandparent, their life, their story. And lo and behold, it turns out that we have certain character traits in common, or even our life pattern goes uncannily similar to them, or we have the same aspirations, values and beliefs, etc. So there's a very precise thing there within the general remit that all the centaurs relate to the ancestral process. So the lid coming off, that means that where Pholus is, there's a great deal of energy that's looking to be released. So it's a very powerful point on the chart for some people. And there too, if a planet is connected to it, it sort of amplifies it.
Yeah.
With Nessus, now the length of the cycle of Pholus is 90 years. So quite a lot of people live that long nowadays, but Nessus is 124. So that tells us right away that it's dealing with themes that are inevitably, longer than one person's life. So again, we have the ancestors and specific cultural references. So in Nessus, one looks for, okay, what are the cultural references that are in my background, my national, racial heritage, that could include religious conditioning, etc. What is the stuff that I need to shed if I am going to individuate any further. That stuff can be very difficult to see because it's part of the ground we stand on. And then there are times when Nessus gets active by transit and situations configure into a buck stops here type of scenario when we suddenly realize, oh my God, look what I'm doing, and I don't need to do this anymore. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now there's a detail in the myth. The mythology around Nessus is very involved and contains many nuances where many very interesting ruminations and interpretations can come of it. But there is a very graphic detail which is a surefire indicator of its process by transit particularly, and this can sometimes show in a natal Nessus which is very prominent, like on an angle or conjunct the sun or something.
Yeah.
And that is a process of feeling the experience of burning, like burning shame, burning anger, burning ambition, burning passion, some kind of experience that we are really gripped by and hooked by, and which therefore can cause enormous suffering. I mean, really serious. So dealing with variations on a theme of misplaced desire is a Nessus theme.
Right.
So you know what I've heard in Buddhist teachings, this wonderful thing where, you know, one of the things that causes us to suffer is that we want what we can't have, and we don't want what we do have.
Right.
And in the middle of that is some kind of middle ground, which eventually, if the heat is turned up enough, that's about the only place we can go. So Nessus is that kind of process, and it is very liberating, and I don't say this lightly. It's the signification of processes that we may not even know a lot of detail about, especially if it's deep ancestral stuff. But we can, like, wake up one morning and know that it has gone. Yeah. And we don't even really know what the it is, but we know that something is different.
Yeah.
And I don't say this lightly. So they are fabulous little things to work with, very alive, and they do provide signification for some of the more elusive, bizarre, or way out places that actually all of us go in our experience. It's just that mostly we don't have a place to talk about it.
Yeah. I have recently had Nessus crossing my IC by transit. And I was picking up on what you were saying earlier on about burning with rage.
Okay.
So,
you know.
So I have a little.
So the IC is, of course, the beginning of the fourth house.
Yeah.
There are 3 houses where I've noticed that, as it were, the ancestors like to hang out, and that's house 4, house 8, and house 12.
Yeah.
So if a centaur goes into one of them by transit, I would immediately become curious about that very theme to do with ancestors. And, for example, you say that you have, that you know the experience of burning rage.
Yeah.
In the field of this transit. Now, I would immediately wonder whether you had tapped into a residue of similar type feelings coming down the ancestral line. And I would never lay claim that is what's happening or anything, but that is what I would be curious about. And what I also know with this kind of stuff is that if one turns one's own process of inquiry towards these kind of areas, then if there is anything to be learned or discovered in that way, well, it presents itself through a dream, a reverie, a synchronicity. It's absolutely magical. And I briefly want to give you an example of this from my own life.
Okay.
Long story short, I lived in London for 22 years, and then I relocated to Bedfordshire. How and where doesn't exactly matter, except I was perplexed as to how I ended up there, because it all happened through synchronicity rather than planned. Wind forward about 8 years, and all around a station of Chiron, which then was transiting in my fourth house, well, I only discover that my father was born in Africa, right? So, but my father's mother was born and baptized in a village about 15 minutes away from where I'm now living. Now, already that's amazing, but what is spectacular is that nobody in the family, including my father, had known where she had come from, which seems incredible, but that is the case. And I picked up the trail through some synchronicities and a dream and some help from some old maps on the internet, and eventually getting the birth certificate from, the GRO, the Government Records Office, etc. And it had all these amazing ripples throughout the whole family when that was discovered. It was just incredible.
Yeah.
So it got to be absolutely literal.
Yeah.
And in the course of the process of finding that out, I began to understand some different things about my own heritage of relocation and travel, long distance travel, etc., you see.
Yeah, I get that. Closing on the centaurs here, would you again say for the benefit of students, if we wanted to interpret our birth chart, which one should we include? Obviously Chiron. Which of the other more recent centaurs would you include?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because there's more than 30 of them now.
Yeah.
And although not all of them have been named, they will be in due course. I personally work routinely with Chiron, Pholus, and Nessus, because to me, there's lots of meat on the bone there, and they really seem to speak.
Exactly.
Now, that said, and this may surprise perhaps some people listening to this, do you know, I very, very rarely offer any kind of interpretation of these guys.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that I found that it is way more fruitful to engage in a simple discussion with the person and to ask some questions.
Yeah.
And what I found is that if there is material of the kind that I've been referencing that is looking to be spoken about in half a minute, you're in there with signification coming so thick and fast that you, as the astrologer, are completely mind blown by what you're hearing, because it just tallies up with your basic astrology.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's almost like, I guess, Pholus and the lid coming off kind of thing. So what I always say to students when I'm teaching about these guys is, don't worry if you think that you don't understand the centaurs. Just stay with the basic astrology and listen to what people are saying. So now, when I say I work routinely with them, I do the following. I will always put the three of them into horoscopes that I am doing for people, and I will very rarely interpret any of them. However, let's say that there's an absolutely major transit sitting on one of them at the moment. Like, for example, the generation of people who've got Chiron in Capricorn. So that's from about 1950 for a few years.
Yeah.
Well, some of them already had it, but they had transiting Pluto waving back and forth across that point for a while. And for some, it's yet to come. Now, that's a mega transit, any way you look at it, and it will show in the signification of what's going on in somebody's life. The same with Pholus and Nessus. So it's very liberating working with these guys, because providing you have put some effort into trying to understand their process in your own horoscope and the horoscopes of people in your family or friends or people that you're close to, if you resonate with them, you will pick it up very, very quickly. And then once that door has opened, you will be likely to find that next time you want to speak with somebody about their horoscope, lo and behold, there's a centaur with a major transit on it. Or they have, let's say, Chiron going over their ascendant. So there is the little arrow of the centaur pointing in the horoscope and saying, look here.
Exactly.
Look here. There's something happening there. And the fact you don't know what it is, I mean, God, that's so liberating.
Yeah, they're going to become more traditional features, but evidently it will take some time.
I don't know if they will or not, James. Yeah. And I tell you why is because the processes that they signal, in my view, are the accompaniment to a particular threshold of awakening that some people cross in their life. And I don't know whether everybody crosses that threshold.
Yeah.
I don't know whether the centaurs will speak in that way on every single chart. I certainly know that the people I see, I mean, the things are absolutely hopping, And also on the occasions when I look at, let's say, a celebrity chart of somebody who's in the news, or even a country chart, to me they speak really loudly. But I can also say that I can see that not everybody's interested in them, and I'm talking now about astrologers. And that's totally fine. Here I want to quote another friend and colleague, Rick Tarnas, who was giving some advice to a new student who was asking, this was now 1994, a conference in Canterbury, UK. And there was a panel discussion, and a student from the floor asked the question of, how do we know what to use? Now, this was even before hardly any centaurs were named. She wasn't talking about them. But there were still, 10,000 asteroids and midpoints and harmonics and you name it.
Yeah.
So one bamboozled student pleading to say, well, how do we know what we're supposed to use? And Rick said something I never forgot. Here's the quote, verbatim. He said, in astrology, you can only work with what is burnished into your soul.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because that
means you can't even work with the ordinary so-called planets, the classical planets, if their meaning and energy and process is not burnished into your soul. They will just be flat on a piece of paper, flat definitions. Now, if you simply limit your astrology to that, well, it will always be rich and alive and fabulous. And then occasionally, like, I also work with some other objects, but my God, I haven't set myself, a campaign of studying all this weird stuff. But if it happens that one starts, as it were, speaking to me through synchronicity, or maybe a client comes and I can see from the chart that there's something else that I don't know much about that's really in focus, well, I will go and study it and try to learn from the client, etc., etc. So it's a living process. But for me, the yardstick is very simple. I work with what feels like it's burnished into my soul.
Yeah.
The rest I can have interest in and maybe learn a little bit about, but I can't work with it.
You can only work with what you can recognize within yourself.
Correct. Yeah. Thank you for putting that so clearly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to just move on to this last little subject here. I mean, computer programs for calculation are everywhere, aren't they? I mean, how important is it to be able to use an ephemeris these days?
I think it's incredibly important, but then I'm sure some people would say, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? Because she's now an oldie. But no, it's my Bible. And truly, I'm saying this. I'm saying this not on commission for anybody who's listening. And I'm, as we speak, reaching for my little ephemerises, because I would not be without them. And here I do specifically mean the little Raphael. I can't imagine not having them. I love the fact that they have the lunations marked across the top of the page with the date and the time and the degree and minute of the zodiac. So I don't have to look stuff up or fumble around. I open the thing and flick a couple of pages, and there it is. And also because the spread of a month is conveniently across 2 pages facing each other. So you've got a whole month spread across, as it were, one spread.
Yeah.
It's 2 pages, but it's one spread. And you can see the matching lunations, new and full, on that page. And also, in the little mutual aspects box in the right-hand side, bottom right, just a little glance through that, and anything major that's happening in that month. It'll tell you the exact day, because sometimes that's not completely clear. When you just whiz down the figures, you say, oh, that looks like it's happening around midnight on that day. Wonder which day it really is. And you can see right away with that, it shows you exactly when something changes sign. It puts the little R and D symbols, so you can see when something's turning direction. And then, of course, all the lunar aspects of the day and the week. It's absolutely brilliant. Those are the main things that I use. And now also another of my favorite, the 2 other favorite pages of mine. One is in the back, and that is the time when the sun, moon, and planets enter the zodiac signs.
Right, the ingresses.
So those are the ingresses, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I love that bit, because that means that I can look up all the solstices and equinoxes on one page, and the time that they're going to happen.
Yep.
And also the time of the ingresses of the other planets, because all of that is incredibly useful.
Absolutely.
And then another absolutely favorite page is the phenomena page. Phenomena. Now, for my taste, I would like even more phenomena on there. But what you have is very full and adequate for sort of normal use. But occasionally, if I go ferreting down a particular trail, I always think, oh, I wish I could see that.
Right. Well, I'll make a note of that.
Okay, brilliant.
The fact that you want more
that's exceptional, James. That is exceptional for the main. I'm just thrilled. For example, I'm looking here at 2013, and it tells me on the 2nd day of January the Earth is in perihelion. Now that is an absolutely crucial date in the calendar, and here. Well, I can't reference this without it sounding like I'm plugging my own work, but there is an astrological retreat, and it's called the 12 Holy Nights, and it's scheduled in such a way that it takes place over the Earth's perihelion, and it lasts from basically Christmas Eve, Christmas Day-ish, through until Epiphany in the Christian calendar.
Yeah.
And there's loads and loads of stuff about it on my website if anybody is interested in following it for themselves.
Okay.
I do sometimes do it as an actual retreat process. But so, for example, so that so inspires me. And then it tells you every month when the moon is in perigee, and that's also important. Those kinds of things, you know. And it does list the equinoxes in that table as well as the other one that I mentioned, and I just love it.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much indeed for a most eloquent, in-depth conversation. Thank you very much indeed, Melanie Reinhart.
Well, James, it's been lovely talking to you.